So welcome everybody. My name is Wes Hallam. I'm the head of customer success at McGraw Hill Europe. We have a really exciting session to be talking about today, all about the future of assessment. How do we balance rigor with meaning? How do we create assessment that is authentic? And how does that impact our pedagogy, and how do we bring pedagogy into it? So I'd like to introduce my three speakers who are on the panel today. First off, we have Dr. Angela Short, who's the Programme Director and Industry Placement Supervisor at the Dundalk Institute of Technology. We have Alex Janes, who is the Senior Lecturer of Strategy and author of Crafting and Executing Strategy at the University of Exeter. And we've got Dr. George Hulene, who is the Professor of Finance and Associate Head of School for Student Experience at Coventry University. So thank you guys. Welcome to the panel. What we're just going to do is a quick little housekeeping check. If you do have any questions that you would like to raise, it really helps us to make sure that the conversation is addressing topics that you want to cover. Please put them into the chat. We will have a Q&A session at the end, and the moderators will pass on any of your questions onto us. So please do get involved. It helps us keep the conversation as relevant to you as possible. So where do we start with assessments? Every year it seems that we come up about what is the purpose and validity of assessment. How do we approach it? How do we do it? So the first question that I want to ask our panel is, what are the biggest drivers in assessment today, and how are they going to affect future assessments? And then the second part to that, what's stopping that from happening? What are the impediments from happening now? So if we want to maximize the video screen, please, and let's get started. Let's go to Angela first. What's your perspective on this?
Okay, so suppose the biggest drivers of assessment is the same driver as it is for learning. And ultimately, I suppose that's going to be guided by students and what students want. And students, certainly in the UK and in Ireland also, are paying fees for their learning. And they want to know is how what they are learning will be used in the workplace. In other words, to what extent will what they learn in college allow them to have a better quality of life, maybe earn a better salary? And so the assessment really has to be around, yes, they have to cover content, but content is free, as we know. So we must find ways to allow the students to be able to apply what they are learning while in college, either through simulations or through work placement, or even just assessment practices in the classroom that allow them to use what they're learning so that they understand what this might look like in the workplace and apply it to that. And I suppose the age-old sort of guidance for assessment, that all assessment needs to be fair, for everybody. And that includes those, with diverse sets of needs. It has to be valid insofar as it has to measure what it's supposed to measure. And thirdly, it has to be reliable, that it will always measure the same things over periods of time or whatever. And I suppose that nothing about that changes over time, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's looking at how, particularly over the last couple of years, we've had these big fundamental shifts, with the pandemic and everything moving into being remote. But ultimately, the fundamentals of what assessment is do stay consistent. George, one of the things that often comes up in these sort of conversations is the purpose of assessment. Is it assessment of learning? Is it assessment for learning or by learning? What do you think currently the status of assessment looks like, and where we should move? What should we be moving more towards in the future?
Thanks, Wes, and hi everyone. Morning. I have to say it's probably a bit of both. I'm from a lot of conversations we're having in the sector, in particular in the UK. I think there's a bit of a mixed message in the higher education sector with regards to what assessment is about and what assessment is for. Is it about testing the learning that students actually complete? Is it about assessing their understanding? Is it about preparing them for their career? And I entirely agree with what Angela has said with regards to we have to have authentic assessments to prepare students for the career that they're building. I would say, looking at the student population, that's the way I look at assessments. I think we are at a bit of a generational change at the moment. And like you mentioned earlier, the pandemic kind of helped us drive this generational change where a lot of students are actually saying, well, sorry, but I don't quite like the assessment strategy that we have in this course. I don't like to have 3-hour exams where I just have to sit down and disseminate everything I memorize. And I'm not saying all students do that, but there is despite having, generation-wise, having the same kind of students we had pre-pandemic, we can see a massive, well, not massive, but a considerable shift in student preferences with regards to the assessments. And I think, the purpose of assessments, you made a very good point at the start. What's the purpose of assessment? I think if you ask 3 key stakeholders, if you ask academics, so the faculty, students, and employers, you will probably get different answers. You'll get different kind of views on the need to have assessments. From conversations we have with students nowadays, you see more and more and more of a need from them, a need to ensure that assessments prepare them like for the career they're going to have as soon as they graduate. And we see a lot of, and I'll wrap up with this because I know we have quite a long session, but we see a lot of emails, a lot of communication from our alumni that actually come back to us and say, do you remember those exams that we had in our accounting modules, for example? Well, I've been working in the sector for 2 years. I've never had an exam as a task. So can you rethink this? And that's, it's one of the limitations within which we're currently working. But yeah, I'm sure we'll have a longer conversation on this. Thanks, Will.
No, I think you're totally right. With the increased focus on what happens post university around that employability conversation and how are we preparing people for the world of work, it's tempting to look at some of the traditional, big exam hall with 300 students in there writing a paper as not necessarily being the best fit for going and starting in the workplace, 2 weeks after you've graduated. But one of the things that can really impact this kind of change in assessment, I think, and Alex, you might be able to talk about this, is it's all very well talking about let's do very authentic assessment, let's change the way we do our assessment, kind of profiling, but there's a big workload requirement on that, that you're, as an academic, as an instructor, that has to be designed, it has to be delivered, it has to be marked. Tell us a little bit about that, Alex. What do you think that kind of workload impediment is proving to be a barrier, or is it something that can be worked around?
I think most of the time it can be worked around, but it represents one of the many tensions that we have in assessment. We want to assess for learning, which means, in a sense, more staged assessments, but that requires a lot more time from the academic in terms of marking and more importantly, giving feedback. And on the other hand, from an efficiency point of view, you'd say you can understand why universities for many years had the kind of one and done approach where you literally do teach for the term, have a 3-hour exam, and you mark that, and the feedback on exam scripts is often very, very minimal. I think it's a tension there in terms of what academics do, whether you have a sufficient cohort of the education and scholarship, the sort of teaching job family, as against the education and research job family. So in terms of the profile of staff within the organisation. So there are a lot of tensions. I think from my own perspective, I would say that staged assessment for learning is becoming increasingly important. And I think that plays to what George was saying about the generational shift. There's much more of a desire, certainly in my experience, from students to have feedback quite early on in a module so that they know how they're doing. They don't want to wait until the end to know how they're progressing. And the other thing I think that we need to think about is we tend to think about assessment as summative assessment, but perhaps, and this comes back to the assessment literacy, what about the formative assessment? In many ways, formative assessment is going on all the time. It's going on in small groups when we're having conversations with students. It's going on in a whole range of perhaps online resources we might use, whether that's questionnaire, multiple choice questions attached to a chapter of a textbook, or whether that's other feedback that's going on during the course of the module. So I think there's a lot of elements there which we need to kind of think about and help students to understand that formative assessment element. I think one of the challenges is actually getting students to do formal formative assessment, if you like, produce a draft of something, for example, and submit that, because a lot of students, if you put formative in front of it, then it doesn't get done. So that there's a tension there. You want to have, you want to be able to give the students feedback, but they have to produce something for you to give feedback on in the first place. The other element, I think, in terms of workload, is that there's no doubt there are things out there in the external environment which mean that we have to look at very hard about the way we assess. Certainly at Exeter, we've had a working group across university working group looking at this, and it's not just the pandemic, it's not just ChatGPT, it's not just the generational shift and what, how students are being prepared for university in the school and college system. I think there are very, very good reasons for actually sitting and questioning what we do and saying, is there a better way to do that? As a sector, we are innovative. We're producing groundbreaking research all the time. We should be doing exactly the same in terms of our pedagogical activity. It would seem to be inconsistent to have sort of world-beating research in sustainability or circular business models, and then say, but we're not going to apply that to the way we teach in the university. So I think that there's an element there where we do need to put that in, and I think university senior management teams need to recognise that is actually going to take a lot of time, potentially, in terms of the faculty learning how to design and operate many of these new assessments, whether they're actually taking them from publishers like yourselves, like at McGraw Hill, or whether they're doing in-house redesigns, actually making sure that that's part of the workload allocation that is put out there. Because I think, as we found during the pandemic, these things do take time to adjust. It takes time to learn the new skills. And that's an important part of, if you like, the HR side of things.
Absolutely, I think you are totally right in that. This is one of those. It feels like it's some same with students. They think about assessment a little bit too late sometimes, and when we're trying to redesign a curriculum or redesign an assessment profile, it can often feel like it's done after the fact rather than when we're doing the design process. Angela, I just wanted to come to you quickly on something. There's a question that popped up in the chat around preparation for the world of work, which, as industry placement supervisor, I think you're probably quite well positioned to talk about. Saying about, is there a a value in using kind of a portfolio of skills approach across a program in addition to kind of traditional assessment styles. What do you see as being the need from industry within your role?
Yeah. Well, first of all, because I see the two questions on the chat about it, and it's not an either or that we're preparing people for the world of work, but it's also learning for learning's sake. But I'm being realistic about what our students want, and having done extensive research in using our student engagement survey in Ireland, and you look at what matters to students. Well, the kind of things matters to students are about, lecturers that are approachable, that are clear about their assessment, that are willing to ask questions, all this. But what's really important as well is how what they're learning will help them in the workplace, because it's costing them money. So we cannot ignore that they need skills that will allow them to get the jobs in the workplace. But it's impossible to acquire skills without engaging in some form of cognitism, some form where you actually have to process information. And so it's not a case that, in the Great Ivory Tower and the Humboldtian form of the university, it was all learning. And the reason you were called a lecturer because you could read and everybody else couldn't. They're not, competing objectives, they come together. But I do agree with Sandra asking about the idea that, that there should be sets of skills that are embedded. But because we have the European credit transfer system and we're all in learning outcomes, remember, we're supposed to be measuring all skills. It doesn't say, at the end of this module or program, the student will know this. They said the student should be able to do the following, and we look for active verbs. I do think sometimes there's a problem in programs where the lecturing staff do not make the connections between the modules. They don't show how what they study in year 1 to year 3, how they are connected to give them, the programmatic skills that we write up at length about when we develop the programs. I do think sometimes students don't see the connection between those. And maybe when we talk about assessment, maybe there's more of an opportunity to use the kind of synoptic assessments that combine the learning in several modules. And Alex talks about the portfolio of work, which is an excellent way of doing that. I can just see one here. I don't know whether you want me to answer about do I think that the learning outcomes need to be assessed in light of ChatGPT? Not the learning outcomes, the assessment needs to be reviewed in the like of ChatGPT. And I know I've had to make adjustments to my assessment to take account of that. But maybe, Wes, you want somebody else to address that question. I have ideas on it, but maybe somebody else you want to address it. I hope I answered the questions that were posed there.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. Thank you. Having this slightly zoomed out view of how assessment feeds into all of this, because assessment is a core part of any course. And the idea that students get super focused on assessment, but only at specific times. When we were discussing this chat beforehand, I know, George, you raised the idea that when students become so assessment focused, and particularly when there are things about when you have the ability to retake or defer or do something else, that the high stakes nature of high stakes assessment becomes less important to students, because they know in the back of their mind that they've got something they can fall back on. What do you think that kind of mentality does to things like ongoing coursework or this kind of portfolio based work? If we're struggling to get students to engage with single point high stakes assessment, can we bring something in, like Angela's saying, around this sort of synoptic point of view? Do you think that's something that we would need to change the motivation of students in how to do that?
I think it would certainly help, but there is another challenge that we have to look into, and that's attendance, student attendance and engagement with their teaching, learning, and subsequently assessments. I'm not sure how the situation looks like in Europe. I can see quite a few people on the session from Europe, but in the UK, from at least 30 universities, I'm kind of speaking with almost each and every week. there is a considerable challenge with student attendance and students focusing on their teaching and learning sessions. To have continuous assessment, if you like to call it that way, I think it's one of the best solutions, because it keeps, hopefully, fingers crossed, it keeps students engaged throughout the semesters. But the challenge is that, we like it or not, students have competing interests at the moment. Many universities have recruited and are actively recruiting students from a widening participation perspective, from backgrounds. Many students might not have the family support at home. They will struggle to focus on their university studies. Certainly, a lot of universities in the UK struggle with not struggle, but they have a challenge with students who are commuting, and many times the timetabling of those teaching and learning sessions is not really conducive for students who are commuting, and that's a challenge. So I think I absolutely agree with what Angela and Alex said with regards to that continuous assessment strategy, if you like. And as Associate Dean myself, this is one of the things I'm looking into with my course directors each and every time we revalidate a program or course. But the challenge we're facing at the moment is that while a lot of students engage with assessments, in the sense that if they have 2 assessment points across 12 weeks, they engage with that, attendance at teaching and learning sessions is significantly lower than attendance with the assessment strategy. So in my view, and I think this is the situation we face at the moment is the result of potentially many decades of transactional education. Education for the purpose of, I'm going to go to go to university, and I'm going to get a job once I graduate. And I think the sectors, and with my previous background in finance, I remember years and years ago where big employers used to say, do you have a first class or upper second degree? And if you don't have a first class or upper second degree, sorry, you can't apply here. But the question should have been, I don't care about what your degree classification is. I have created this assessment as a bank. I'm not going to name any banks. I have created this assessment, and I want you to sit down and take it. And let's see what you managed to learn throughout the 3 years or 2 years or 1 year, depending on how long that program was at university. So that transaction, I think it's a cultural background that all of us are guilty of in a way. We've all kind of fueled, we've all kind of facilitated that transactional perspective of assessments. I do assessments because I need a degree. I need to progress from level 4 to level 5 to level 6. And I don't do it just because I want to see how much I've learned. And this is where formative assessment would be extremely helpful. But I don't do it because I want to test my understanding, and I want, we keep speaking about feedback, but I want that feed forward. I want to understand how I can progress, how I can develop myself. But many students, not of their fault in a way, I don't want to, I'm far from me to blame students for this. They enter the sector that kind of build that culture for them. So get a first class because you want to work for an investment bank. But, that doesn't have anything. You can get a first class and not be prepared to work for an investment bank. And you can get a third class and be an absolutely outstanding investment banker. So that's, that transactional perspective, in my view, is something that, without a doubt, we have many, many, many years to actually crack.
Can I just come in there, because one of the solutions that I have found that really works for me is I teach operations management, and I use the Connect platform, and I use the Smart Book adaptive readings, and I use the simulation game. And my assessment is continuous, and recognizing that a lot of our students are working 40 hours a week and need to work to afford to go to college. I actually am offering my classes hybrid online. So they're coming to the classroom, but those that want to join online can join also. But each of the stages of my assessment has a deadline set, but they're all open at the beginning of term. But it means if somebody is working, if they do their smart reading book and they do the simulation game module, they'll have done the work, they'll have achieved the outcomes, even if they didn't attend for class. So it's recognizing that students aren't necessarily ready to learn between 9 and 10 on a Wednesday morning when it suits us. But if we give them access to both the content and the assessment, and we can stand over it and say that, yes, we can stand over that they have achieved the outcomes and that they have the requisite skills, I don't see how we can, I don't see why there's an issue. And certainly I've noticed that, in the courses I do, when I sign off on them passing the module, I know they've engaged with the module, and I know that, they've actually done the assessment. And I know we'll probably talk about ChatGPT again, but again, like that, I had to look at that. But even using calculation questions that are algorithmic in a Connect, that gets around ChatGPT, because I tested it and it confuses it. Once you have more than a few numbers, ChatGPT gets confused and it gets further away. No doubt they'll improve the artificial intelligence, but the minute it's okay. But I do think, George, what you have to do is track the students in the learning and assessment. Attach it to 2 marks for this, 4 marks for this, and you'll be surprised how students are willing to gather their marks as they go along. And even into my game modules, I allow them unlimited attempts for that feedback and feed forward that you mentioned as well. And it's the same on the Smart Book. They're getting constant feedback that Alex has recognized none of us would have time to give them on an individual basis. So in this case, I'm leveraging the technology from the publishers that are solving my problems and doing it relatively successfully, I think.
And that,
Yeah, I do agree that we have to be more relaxed about this, the synchronous and asynchronous divide. And I think I read an article on the BBC, which was basically surveying the fact that most students in the UK and Ireland, I think it was just the UK, actually work and do have substantial work-related activities. Maybe not necessarily career oriented stuff, but they're working to pay their way through college and university. So we have to recognize that. And as long as students are engaging with the materials either synchronously or asynchronously, I think I agree with Angela there. I can see we've got quite a few elements on ChatGPT.
Yeah.
And I think just to go, are you all right with Wes if I just kind of pitch in on this?
Yeah, please do. Please do.
Danny has posted a couple of questions there, which I think are very pertinent. Do we need to rethink assessment with ChatGPT? I think some people will, for sure, if they're doing the sort of one and done traditional essays, which a large chat module with predictive capabilities and which has been taught on a large volume of text, then the ChatGPT is going to be able to produce answers which are indistinguishable from what a student might produce, and you have an issue there with saying, well, do we get into an arms race and constantly try and up things like Turnitin and the various sort of detection softwares, and I think in many ways we're probably on a losing game to that, because I suspect that ChatGPT has got far more venture capital behind it than the alternative companies we might be using, and that does mean that yes, we do need to redesign. But I also think that good assessment design is proof against a lot of the changes in the environment. And yes, you could argue, should we have been assessing lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy in university anyway? Higher education is surely about the higher levels, about the very least the analytical, but more appropriately the critical, the evaluative, and the synthetic. Those are much more important in terms of the learning outcomes. So I guess it's about content versus skills, and I think that goes back to what Keith was saying in his question. Yeah, it is about skills and cognition, not about necessarily just the content. And I guess I think we're all from business backgrounds, aren't we? On this panel, so we may have been doing our kind of STEM and humanities and social sciences colleagues a disservice in our assumptions about students. Certainly, my first degree was in history and philosophy, so I was very much in the humanities side of things back in the day. But yes, there are still, I think, creative and interesting ways that we can assess, which don't go back to the traditional essay or 3-hour exam. And certainly, from my perspective, using a simulation, I use a slightly different one because I'm teaching strategy. So my module is in general more of a synthesis because it's a capstone module. So it comes at the end of the course of study. And I'm getting the students to pull together all of the things that they've learned on the other modules and use it to run a company as a board of directors. Now, they get a score for that. We prepare them by actually giving them some questions so that they understand some of the basics. We make sure that they've got that. It's useful as a diagnostic because it means I can then focus on the students that perhaps are not game ready. We then move on to some practice rounds, and then they do a number of rounds in the simulation where they're running the company against other people in the class, and they're putting in place the operations side of things, the marketing, the HR, and all of those decisions that they would be making as senior managers. That there's an outcome, and then we will have a discussion, sometimes a class discussion, but more often I actually use consulting time. So I will just have individual teams of 4 or 5 coming along to my office for 30 minutes, an hour consulting time to actually discuss the performance of the company, talk about their strategy, talk about things that they feel have gone well, things that haven't gone so well. And those are things which I would have done as a manager, as a director, with members of a team that were in charge of a business unit. So it's about building some of those authentic elements in. But I can't see how, in a sense, ChatGPT would be able to cope with that. You couldn't download the scorecard and the dashboard into ChatGPT and say, what should we do next? And I'm not sure if that software will ever be capable of saying, what strategy should the company follow? I think, software to do that is going to be much more sophisticated and probably will stay behind proprietary to the individual company that's developed it because it's their competitive advantage in the marketplace.
Yeah.
I just like to jump in on that one there. Oh yeah, shush, Angela, it's my turn now. One of the things you mentioned there, Alex, which was really important, was around that assessment design, and with the influx of ChatGPT. And by the way, small plug, we did do a session on ChatGPT yesterday, and one of the speakers from that did a podcast interview with us. So if you do want to really deep dive into what ChatGPT is doing around assessment, please do go give that a listen. Small plug. But the thing you mentioned there around assessment design and good assessment design kind of obstructing any of that interference. We saw a really clear example of that in the first lockdowns around the pandemic, when we suddenly saw that assessment all had to go online, and we got struck with that really thorny challenge of students in different time zones, students not accessing at the same time. And what we saw was that most universities opted for an assessment to be open for 24 hours to give people the time to do it. And there were real concerns there around, well, they're just going to go and Google the answer. They're just going to go and send the essay off to somewhere else, to an essay farm, or to go get somebody else to do it for them. And some of those concerns were borne out. We saw some really high performance results in that first period of assessment during lockdown. But what we started to see was people then tweaking their assessment design. So, it might be available for 24 hours, but students could only do it for an hour. Or we had algorithmic questions, like Angela said, where the question values actually change and moderate through. So I think because ChatGPT is very new at the moment, it's a little bit, it is an unknown. We don't really know what the capabilities of it are like. It's very tempting for us to think, in my opinion, that we have to completely and fundamentally change every way that we do assessment. But it's about thinking about how are we actually using that assessment? What is the assessment doing? And to Danny's point about the lower levels of Bloom's taxonomy, Alex is right. We want to be testing them on this higher level application, a higher level evaluation and critical thinking, not necessarily as much of, can you remember and regurgitate information? Now, that is hard to implement. And, there are tools and different things that and different approaches that people take. But ultimately, I feel like we should be aiming to, again, have that authentic assessment of how can somebody apply these skills and how can somebody actually utilize the knowledge that they've learned in an application or an environment.
Mm-hmm.
We have a really good question in here from Sandra, actually, which is, how do you think the university sector work with employers to revise criteria for employment? So I think I might toss this over to Angela for your expertise. That what is that feedback loop like from universities to industry? Is there something that we can be doing differently or something better around that?
Yeah. A couple of things in that. For me, every time I go to visit my students that are out in placement, that's my window to the world about what's happening. And it's funny when you talk about, the kind of skills business students want, if I keep on saying to my students, Excel. Anybody who can use Excel is like a hero in every office. And it's interesting, that hasn't changed. Once you can take, all this data and produce for an employer some real information, that becomes a really valued skill. But it's really interesting because we were talking about, authentic assessment and how we have to look at different ways and how we can sort of bypass ChatGPT and at the same time match the skills of employers that they want employability. And if we think about it, how does an employer assess incoming candidates? By interview. And yet the interview is probably the most underutilized tool we have in higher ed. We use the viva voce for the doctorate or for the final capstone thesis. But we should look out to industry and see, what does Google, and I mightn't be employer now, what do? They used to use group interviews, and that way they eliminated. So what if your assessment was the interview of a candidate at the end, maybe not at the end of every year, but at the end of the year, where the different stakeholders from the marketing, finance, and all the rest put the candidate in front of them, either in groups or teams, and got them to work together. And so we're talking about trying to adjust our assessment to meet the needs of industry and yet meet the needs of the student from a point of view of embedding core skills and those higher levels of Bloom. And yet the employers use the interview. So there could be something in that ChatGPT can't appear at interview for Mary, who's going for the job. Just an idea.
I think you're very right there. We are seeing the rise of interview practice as part of a course. It's beginning to gain a bit of popularity. We tended to see things like interview practice as being a third year kind of career preparedness course, as opposed to something being integrated more readily into just the kind of ongoings. And Alex, I really liked your approach of getting people to talk to you and offering a consultancy session. In fact, one of the things that talking to an instructor about the other day was, particularly around ChatGPT and with essays, is it's very difficult for somebody to defend an essay or a piece of work that they've done where they've used a generative tool, an AI tool or something like that. And what they had introduced is something very simple, that for the essays that they were writing, is they would have a 5-minute conversation with the student to say, okay, tell me what the strongest points of your essay are, or having a quick glance over it and raising one critique. if the person hasn't written the essay, if the person doesn't deeply understand that knowledge, it's one thing to write an essay, it's another thing to defend it. That's why we have the Vivas at PhD level. It's the defense of your arguments that is often the most challenging part. George, I just wanted to toss over to you to this for now, because I know that obviously with your role as associate dean, is it associate dean or assistant dean? I can never quite remember which way around it is. Associate dean, sorry. That I know that you and I before have had conversations about how do we move people into the workforce, and how do we better prepare people from that kind of graduate scheme perspective and getting them into roles. From your perspective as sort of is senior leadership within the school, how does assessment design that you're asking your colleagues and other people within your department to do, how do those two things actually link up? Are they a joined up process, or are they fragmented? How does that work?
It is fragmented in many areas, purely because for many years, and in particular during the pandemic, we didn't really have a very strong relationship with the industry, with the sector. So we were sending students out as graduate scheme, successful employees, but we never really learned how did the sector actually change as a result of the pandemic. How did the banking sector, how did the business sector, how did the marketing, the sports management, the event management, and so on. In our faculty, we have 9,500 students, and hundreds of employers we collaborate with, but because of the pandemic, we really struggled because we had, and I really like what you said earlier about, well, assessments really had to change during the pandemic to make sure that they were sustainable, they were inclusive for the population of students that we had, and they were really supportive in helping them achieve those learning outcomes that they need, and to build that understanding that they have, that they need for the roles they get. But for me, having conversations, I call them tripartite meetings with course directors, students, and employers. So I create a triangle between them and try to bring everyone together. The underlying message is very simple. We need, and now I speak as an employer, this is what companies tell us. We need universities to prepare, our future employees to hit the ground running as fast as possible as soon as they get a job. And when you have a situation like that and a faculty like ours, 9,500 students, at my last count, from around 68 different countries, students who will go back to their countries, how do you achieve that in terms of international students might actually say, well, I'm not really interested in what the employers want in the UK because I'm going back to my country in Africa or Southeast Asia, or I'm going back to Australia, and there's a different requirements from there. It's a very complex system to navigate, assessment system to navigate. But the underlying point, every time I have conversations with, it probably happens every other week now, the underlying message is the assessments I do at the university have to prepare me for the job that I want to get in the future. And that's a considerable problem because, as you know, Wes, and we've had, like you said, we've had many conversations on this, but there are a lot of restrictions we are facing. You look at PSRB's professional statutory and regulatory bodies, in particular for the accounting programs that we have. The requirement is very simple. If you want the accreditation for your program, you have to have an exam. And you think, well, yes, but I'll have an exam. It's okay. It's very simple. The simplest form. What a lot of PSRBs don't recognize is that the simplest form of assessment for a university is the exam. It takes us 3 hours to put it together. It's, we ask students to come and sit in an exam hall, do it for another 3 hours. We mark everything, and that's it. That's the simplest form of assessment, right? But the least effective one. It doesn't prepare students for team working, for communication skills, for initiatives. It doesn't make students resilient, not at all. If anything, quite the contrary. So the assessment strategy that universities use pretty much across the world has to prepare, in my view, and I think I have a well-informed view, based on all the conversations I've had throughout the years, has to prepare students for their work of place. We are, and you know, I can see a lot of comments in the chat about Chat GPT. I actually celebrate something like Chat GPT. I'm very happy it was launched. I was reading last night that Google is just about to launch, or they might have launched their version of ChatGPT. I think these are innovations in the wider sector, in the wider world, that will force us to rethink what we do. And my question for ChatGPT, yes, with ChatGPT, I'm 50-50. 50% of me thinks, oh dear, you know, if you don't have a well-written assessment that takes into account that genuine personal knowledge, yes, you will struggle, because a lot of students will probably think, well, ChatGPT will do it for me for either for free or for a few pounds. So that's 50% of me thinks like that. But the other 50% thinks, wow, when will we start using ChatGPT in our teaching and learning?
Yeah.
And when, you know, how many years from now, if you think of 2027, 2028, we will actually look back and think, you remember in 2023, we were worried about ChatGPT, and now it's the norm in our teaching and learning, as is Google historically, because Google was the same reaction was to Google. Oh dear, everybody, libraries won't be full. We had students asking us to get the library open 24/7.
Yeah.
And as you know, Wes, you've been many times. I mean, you're very close to Coventry University. The library at 3 o'clock in the morning is 60% full. These students want to come to university, despite having the likes of Google, the likes of all the online, you know, digital services and so on. So I think with ChatGPT, I would say, I'd go as far as saying, yes, there is a challenge. It will force us, as it should, because as a higher education sector, we are monsters of old habits. We like to fall back on, you know, not very often. We try to have revolutionized the assessment strategies and the teaching and learning strategies. So we need something like ChatGPT and others to force us. But in the same time, we have to ask ourselves very critically and constructively, how do we use it to facilitate that deeper learning for students, and how do we make ChatGPT a friend on one side and a bit of a, I don't want to say enemy, but you know, a bit of a not so good partner with regards to the assessments, let's say.
Yeah.
I think you're totally right on that, George. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of things that you said there, because of a few of the comments that came in. One of which around being, you know, how far removed from the world of work is the assessment that we're designing. And you raised the point perfectly with ChatGPT there. You know, 20 years ago, the idea of the internet being used in everything all the time and being the only thing would have been a little bit laughable. People going, no, it's not going to be everywhere. It's not going to happen. But we still have to prepare our students to, you know, now we have research methods, lectures and courses around how do I use the internet to research effectively? Because once they go out into the world, the internet exists. They're going to be using it. And the same, as you said, with ChatGPT, it's not going to disappear. So it's only, you know, as with all things AI, they only ever get bigger and more complex. So potentially the conversation should be being had of how do we design assessment? How do we incorporate assessment that is looking at things that does incorporate things like ChatGPT? In how do we make that work? How do we get that to function in our benefit, in our favor? But also making sure that we're not just sticking our head in the sand about it and pretending like it's going to go away. Because if the whole purpose of our assessment, if it's either assessment for or assessment by, or whatever framework we want to use for our assessment portfolio, we can't ignore the world outside, and we can't just pretend like students are going to go out into the world of work and then not use it. You know, for example, I use AI generative tools all the time for my work, but I would never have been taught that or used that or done anything with that within a higher education space when I went through it. Alex, I wanted to come to you actually on that one, because obviously the way that you do your portfolio based work, you are testing things that an AI tool can't do. As we said, teamwork, conflict management, how to work as part of a group. Do you think things like that will become more valid, more relevant in this sort of new post-pandemic AI enhanced world that we find ourselves in now?
Yeah, I think a lot of those skills, the critical thinking, indeed. Now, some of the elements again goes back to these tensions. Students recognise that, for example, group work is something that employers value. That there are lots of positives about group work. Now, I did some research a few years ago as part of we have a innovation incubator at Exeter, looking at group work to rewrite the university's policy on that. And one of the things we found was that there was this tension. Students both hated and loved group work and different aspects of it. So I think there's always going to be that tension of saying, well, group work is one way around that. But also, I think what we're saying, assessment design, incorporating ChatGPT where we can actually can help students to plan, to framework writing, to express themselves better. But we just have to be, I think, honest about the fact that it's going to be used, and instead of saying it's banned, we're not going to actually build it in where it's relevant to do so. But in other instances, design assessment that means that ChatGPT and essay mills and all the other things that can impact on academic integrity actually are much less relevant, and that often requires assessment which is very clear about engagement with the actual module that we're doing. And it also means that we need to move away from, in a sense, just lazy module design. If we're not looking at the latest research, and I think universities need to be have research-informed teaching. If we're trotting out the same theories that have been around for decades, and we're just saying to students, write something on, I don't know, the Ansoff matrix or Porter's generic strategies, then there's no end of resources online. There's no end of people at the end of a phone at an essay mill. There's no reason why ChatGPT shouldn't produce something very valid. If, on the other hand, you're integrating the latest research, if you're integrating opportunities to write critically about different elements, then again, there's much less likelihood that students are going to be able to compile something without having to do their own thinking. I know people are saying increasingly that reflective writing is going to be one of the ways in which we counter this. I don't know. I mean, I think there are kind of two camps on this at the moment. I certainly have been in sessions where they say reflective writing is kind of ChatGPT proof, and other people saying actually it's not. So we shall see. I've got to admit, I do ask students to write reflective papers, but what I tend to do is I tend to focus it very much on activities and elements within the module that they have to have experienced themselves. And that tends to mean that it's less open to to mischief, as it were. But I think also we need to think about different formats. What about people who are visual learners? Maybe you could do a Pecha Kucha type thing in terms of a presentation, using video, using podcasts, dare I say it, and those are all things which, yes, they may well be called to do in in the world of work. White paper, writing a white paper instead of an essay. There are lots of different ways I think we can look at this and say we're testing many of the same skills, many of the same attributes, but we're doing it in different formats which often will, I think, engage students more as long as they're explained well, and as long as we take the time to, again, give them that assessment literacy, because we do train them to write essays very well in many institutions, but do we train them to do group work? Do we train them to do good presentations? Do we train them to write blogs and podcasts and things like that? And those elements can be across a whole range of different disciplines. It's not just business schools. This can be something that people in humanities, in STEM subjects use, and indeed I know at Exeter, many of my colleagues have. So yeah, I think changing assessment design, it goes back to that. I don't think ChatGPT is something we should worry about overly, because good assessment design will overcome that. There's some very good stuff by a couple of people. I think it's Edinburgh Napier University. There's an article in the Times Educational Supplement which I would kind of recommend people have a look at. I don't think we need to worry about that, but we should find ways of integrating it. Use it as an opportunity as much as a threat. So I agree with Nada in the question there. Definitely, it is an opportunity, and it is forcing people to rethink assessment. Good, innovation is our lifeblood. It's what we're about as a sector. It should be in the pedagogy too.
Yeah.
Precisely. Angela, you wanted to jump in there. I'm conscious we are running a little bit short on time, but I want to give you the chance to respond to that.
Yeah, I've nearly forgotten what I was going to say. Now, I think I was going to agree with some of the stuff George had said. I just can't recall. But to pick up on what Alex has talked about, group work and group assessment, and employers like the teamwork. Students love group work, especially first and second years as a way of getting to know people. What they hate is the lazy assessment of group work. They don't want an assessment where there's 1 mark for 5 people, where 2 did the work and 3 loafed for the whole time. And I think it's been a bit of a cop-out when we've had larger numbers of assessment to give a group assessment and then just have to mark 1 piece of work. If we're going to do a group work assessment, it needs to be supported, it needs to be managed, it needs to be, as you said, taught, teach them how to engage. And group work in college is not like teamwork in the workplace, because group work in college, the lecturer says, okay, here's your groups, off you go, sort yourself out. I've got nothing to do with it. You're big people now, you can look at it after. There's always in the workplace is a supervisor, a team lead who says, hold on, you're not doing your work. So what we do with the students is we give them all the responsibility with none of the authority to apply the rules that would normally happen in the workplace. So I think that we need to be fair and make sure, because assessment is a moral activity. We are playing with people's lives, with people's, livelihoods. And we have to make sure that what we're doing is fair, reliable, valid, and all the rest, ChatGPT or whatever. Okay.
You're totally right. And we had a really interesting example from, I think it was at Westminster or Brunel, where they, on the first year module where they had group work, they brought in students from the second year who'd done the module in the prior year to come in as supervisors for it. And that's been a really interesting activity. So particularly they use some quite different assessment techniques that are in there, and so the supervisors come in to kind of orientate everybody around, say, okay, this is what you do, this is how to do it. But then they do have a senior figure within there that they can go to and say, well, Joe over here isn't pulling his weight particularly. And you have a supervisor there to give that authentic assessment of how much work are people actually putting in, who sits in on the group meetings and does all that kind of stuff. So I think, we have covered a huge amount of ground today. I'm conscious that we've got about a minute left. So I just wanted to thank everybody. I think we have covered some really hot topics at the moment, and kind of got deep into the detail as to why we're assessing and exploring what the purpose of those assessments have been. So The last thing for me to do today is to thank my three panelists, so Angela, Alex, and George. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. We'll be probably having some follow-up chats from this later on to dive more into your expertise. And thank you, everybody, for attending. So, Angela, thank you. Alex, thanks again.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, pleasure. Great questions, by the way. That was some, that
Thanks,
was really interesting.
Yeah, brilliant. Right, well, thanks a lot, guys, and I hope we will see you all in the next sessions as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.